Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew, for that lovely introduction, and to everyone here at the American Revolution Institute and the Society of the Cincinnati for inviting me here tonight. I am thrilled to be speaking with you today to discuss my book, Marquis de Lafayette Returns, and Lafayette's 1824-1825 tour of America. Lafayette's national tour was a monumental moment in American history and a true cultural event. It is estimated that millions of Americans came out to greet him over the course of his 13-month tour. During this time, Lafayette traveled to each of the 24 states and traveled over 6,000 miles, taking part in hundreds of parades and ceremonies, and he was bestowed with countless awards, honors, toasts, and poems. In Alexandria, Virginia, educator Benjamin Hallowell had gotten married shortly before Lafayette's visit, and he took the time to pen a poem about the Lafayette pandemonium. He wrote that each lover of liberty surely must get something in honor of Lafayette. There's a Lafayette watch chain and a Lafayette hat, a Lafayette this and a Lafayette that. But I wanted something as lasting as life, and I took to myself a Lafayette wife. At first glance, one might hear this poem as something quite silly, equating his marriage to a simple Lafayette souvenir. But Hallowell's mention of souvenirs in this poem is something a bit more than a convenient rhyme. From August 1824 to September of 1825 and beyond, no American was spared from Lafayette fever. When I began my research, the souvenirs that were produced in the wake of Lafayette's tour immediately came to the forefront. If you wanted something, anything with Lafayette's face on it in the early 19th century, chances are you could get it. There were ribbons, pottery, plates, smoking pipes, gloves, snuff boxes, even Lafayette watch chains and Lafayette hats, as Hollowell mentioned. You name it, Lafayette's face was slapped on it and sold. Even in the years following Lafayette's tour, these items continued to be advertised in American newspapers. Alexandria merchant Robert H. Miller was advertising a further supply of Lafayette ware, along with tea sets, gold edge, and a view of Mount Vernon well into the late 1820s. Even though Lafayette at that time was long gone from our shores, Americans still looked for tangible memories of his visit. There are thousands of these pieces that have sat in private collections and public archives for centuries. Each item was not only purchased by someone, but saved and preserved, passing through the hands of family members, treasured and loved. As we are in the thick of celebrating this bicentennial, many of these pieces are now on display as part of special exhibitions commemorating Lafayette's visit, including the exhibition Fete Lafayette right behind me in the room. But as I continued to research, these souvenirs continued to stay with me for a multitude of reasons. One, the sheer number and variety of these items meant that the demand for Lafayette was universal and long-lasting. Two, these pieces meant the concept of people wanting a physical item as the memory of an event is not a new concept. And three, it meant that Lafayette meant something very important to Americans in the 19th century. When I first set out on this research, I assumed that getting to the root of Lafayette's importance would have a simple answer, and that answer would be something along the lines that Lafayette was a hero of the Revolution. And while that is certainly a very large part of the reason why Lafayette's return was so important, I soon discovered that Lafayette meant something more. Lafayette returned to America at a time of deep political division. His arrival brought Americans together, if only for a brief moment, and left a legacy so lasting it remains to this day, 200 years later. So why was Lafayette so important? Why was this tour so important? What was the significance of his visit to Washington? And perhaps the biggest question of all, why are we taking the time to celebrate this bicentennial? And to answer these questions, it's always helpful to go back a little bit. Because when we think of Lafayette, this is probably one of the most common ways that he's pictured. The young, dashing, wealthy hero in a military uniform who volunteered to fight for America for two reasons, one being revenge and two being liberty. Lafayette was born into the French noble class, and his life was shaped by an event that occurred before he could even talk. In 1759, at the age of when Lafayette was 2 years old, Lafayette's father was killed at the Battle of Minden during the Seven Years' War. At the time of his father's death, Lafayette inherited the family titles. When Lafayette was 12, his mother died, leaving Lafayette an orphan and then one of the richest men in France before the age of 13. Many scholars argue that the death of Lafayette's father is what birthed Lafayette's hatred of the British and led him to enlist in the American Revolution, but I believe that him being French also had a hand in this as well. After the death of his mother, arrangements were made for Lafayette's future. His uncle negotiated with the Duc de Noailles for Lafayette to marry the Duke's second oldest daughter, Adrienne. For Lafayette, who had the titles and money but very little societal connections, he could not have married up any further unless he married into the French royal family. Despite it being an arranged marriage, Lafayette was 16 and Adrienne was 14 at the time of their marriage. It proved to be a love match as well, with Adrienne being an influential force in his life, more so than most women, much less French noble women in the 18th century. Lafayette was enraptured when he first heard the news of what was happening in the American colonies. At 19 years old, he sailed across the Atlantic and knocked on the door of Congress pledging his service. But Lafayette was not the only French noble looking to assist the American cause. But unlike his own countrymen, many of whom were only really seeking a title and payment, Lafayette was, in his own words, here to learn and not teach. And he soon proved his bravery on the battlefield, eventually winning over the stoic George Washington, who was initially really unimpressed with this unexperienced Frenchman. The two men became extremely close over the course of the war. When Lafayette was shot in the leg during the Battle of Brandywine, Washington told those overseeing his care to care for him as if he were my own son. That quote has become very famous, although it is important to keep in mind Lafayette is the one who said that Washington said that in his own memoirs later, though I am certain Washington intentionally meant that as well. In all, Lafayette spent over $200,000 of his own money on the American cause, which included purchasing uniforms and muskets for his men during the bitter winter encampment at Valley Forge. And though it was not through his efforts alone, he was instrumental in binding France's allegiance to America. And throughout the entirety of the war, Lafayette served without pay. When Lafayette returned to France in the 1780s, Americans saw him as a hero, a selfless soldier who was instrumental in the victory at Yorktown and helping to end the war. After the Revolution, Lafayette returned to France with the expectation that his experience serving in the American Revolution would help bring the ideas of liberty and equality back to his home country. Unfortunately, in his absence, the French monetary support of the American Revolution depleted France's finances, driving further division between the French royals and nobles and the common people. Lafayette returned to France as the country was on the cusp of their own revolution. He still supported the idea of a monarchy, though he was hopeful France would evolve to a constitutional monarchy where the people still had representation and a voice. Soon, Lafayette found himself torn between two sides, the aristocracy and the people. And as the terror in France escalated, nobles especially were targeted. Realizing that the blade of the guillotine was likely his fate, Lafayette fled from France with the hopes of going to America. He was captured en route and was imprisoned in Prussia and Austria for 5 years, from 1792 to 1797. Upon his release from prison, Lafayette took a brief step back from politics, partially due to the rise of Napoleon and partially due to the health of his wife. After Adrienne died in 1808 and the Bourbon restoration of the French monarchy, Lafayette returned to politics. His almost rabid advocacy for liberty and equality was his driving force throughout his life, which did not make him the most popular man in France. By the 1820s, Lafayette was tolerated at best. He was broke, and he was ready for a change of pace. And across the ocean, America was in a similar but different position. By 1824, although America was still a country in its infancy, the idea of what America would be and how its founding would be remembered was definitely on the mind of its citizens. In fact, the mythology of the founding generation begins when they're still alive. John Adams even writes about this in a 1790 letter to Benjamin Rush when he says that The history of our revolution will be continued, one live from one end to the other. The essence of the whole will be that Dr. Franklin's electrical rods smoked the earth and outsprung George Washington, that Franklin electrified him, and thenceforward these two conducted all the policy negotiations, legislation, and war. In 1824, in addition to grappling with this founding mythology, America's mind was also heading towards the upcoming 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and America's birthday. This landmark was an opportunity to look back and celebrate, but after years of war and political division, patriotism and unity were waning, and it really didn't seem that many were in a celebratory mood. Additionally, the nation was under the presidency of James Monroe, who was first elected in 1816. In the aftermath of the War of 1812, Monroe wanted to continue this sense of national unity, viewing political parties as the source of division within the country. And while partisan politics was something that Monroe was hoping to avoid, political resentment grew under his administration. And as party factions grew, the Federalist Party collapsed, and the idea of who would lead the nation into this non-founder future started to take shape. In the hopes of stirring up some fervor and excitement, Monroe starts to look across the Atlantic to a hero who is still very much alive and beloved, and this was Lafayette. Monroe's connection to Lafayette was not just some simple thread of American patriotism. When Monroe had served as the American minister to France, he and his wife, Elizabeth Courtwright, were instrumental in saving Adrienne Lafayette's life. During the terror, many members of Adrienne's life were executed, and Adrienne herself was imprisoned. And the Monroes worked with French officials to spare Adrienne's life the day before she was scheduled for her own execution. In 1824, Lafayette was the last surviving major general of the American Revolution, and one of the very last links to Washington, at least in a military sense. Lafayette was respected, revered, and loved by Americans. If invoking the memory of Washington and the founding of the nation and the Franco-American alliance, which secured the victory of Yorktown, could not bring the nation together, what could? So in February of 1824, President Monroe wrote to Lafayette inviting him to America for a visit of celebration, and Lafayette enthusiastically agreed. The plan was set into motion. Lafayette books passage on a ship. He arranges for his son, George Washington Lafayette, and his personal secretary, Auguste Levasseur, to travel with him. And it was on August 15th, 1824, when Lafayette once again stepped onto American soil, first landing on Staten Island. The next day, he sailed across the harbor to a reception at Castle Clinton, which is depicted here in this mid-19th century painting. At Castle Clinton, about 50,000 people lined the streets to welcome him, and the population of New York City at this time was 150,000, so a third of the entire city came out to greet him. Lafayette's secretary, Auguste Levasseur, kept a detailed journal of his travels, and his description of the New York crowd was as follows. The cannon thundered from the shore, in the forts, and from all the vessels of war. On our way, all the streets were decorated with flags and drapery, and from all the windows, flowers and wreaths were showered upon the general. This scene would be replayed almost every single day of Lafayette's tour. Large cities, small cities, towns that Lafayette was just simply passing through would replicate this pageantry of appreciation. And on every stop, the crowds followed. This is my absolute favorite depiction of Lafayette's tour. You can see Lafayette in an open coach on the right-hand side. You have the people kind of scrambling to greet him, waving their hats, hoping that they're going to he can see them. The smoke is the cannon fire. And then my favorite part is the people in the windows, just hoping for a glimpse. There's something beautiful about those like romantic kind of mid-19th century paintings, but this pen and ink drawing, which was likely done by the artist shortly after this event has happened, really kind of shows the energy of what it must have been like to see him. Lafayette's tour was one of the very first documented cases of tourism on such a massive scale here in America, with a single event, or in this case, person, driving groups of people to travel outside of their home. And especially in smaller cities, the number of people who came to greet Lafayette frequently outnumbered the recorded population of the towns at the time. Keep in mind, the big new invention of transportation in the 1820s is the steamboat. So if you're not traveling by water, you're traveling by foot, you're traveling by horse, you're traveling by coach. And if you're traveling any sort of distance for the hopes of seeing one guy, that is a significant travel. When Lafayette spent the winter of 1824-1825 here in Washington, temporary lodging in boarding houses and taverns saw maximum capacity in an otherwise quiet time in the city, further proving that people are traveling for the hopes of seeing him. The New York Mirror and Ladies Literary Gazette wrote on August 21st that gentlemen are ready to throw by their business to shake him by the hand, and ladies forget their lovers to dream of him. If a man asks, "Have you seen him?" you know who he means, which I think sums up everything perfectly. Lafayette's national tour brought Americans together in a way that was unprecedented before or after, and the fact that he was nearly universally beloved may have largely been due in part to the fact that the French Revolution kept him in France. Shortly after Lafayette's release from his 5-year imprisonment, America entered the quasi-war with France in 1798. And although compared to other entanglements between countries, very little blood was shed, it left very strained relations between these two powers. Lafayette wrote to his friends in America about the possibility of seeking asylum in America, and he was encouraged not to come. He writes a letter to Alexander Hamilton, one of his very good friends, and Hamilton writes back that he really fears it's not in America's best interest to let Lafayette come to America. And it is a quite nasty letter. Hamilton writes, "I have never been able to believe that France can make a republic, and I have believed that the attempt, while it continues, can only produce misfortunes. I give you this assurance on the faith of our former friendship." That's one of his very best friends writing this. Despite his harsh words, Hamilton's letter closes with a sentiment that would define Lafayette's legacy for decades to come, that despite constant infighting, the only thing in which our parties agree is to love you. Hamilton was correct, though I don't know if he was intentional when he wrote that. Early American politics were bitterly torn apart by Federalists and Democratic Republicans, and by remaining outside the fray, Lafayette was never forced to choose a side, and therefore he remained this politically neutral figure. Lafayette first arrived in the city of Washington on October 12, 1824. It was only recently established, and by 1824, only about 15,000 residents called Washington, D.C. home. The Washington that we know today, with its neoclassical structures, was far from reality. Auguste Levasseur was largely unimpressed with Washington, writing upon his arrival that, drawn on a gigantic scale, the plan of Washington cannot be filled out for a century. They also were traveling from Washington from Baltimore, and the Lafayette and his traveling party had a wonderful time in Baltimore. Baltimore had a huge French population, and they had spent the week before having like this big art scene. So I think they were a little bit disappointed when they came in. But Washington was also a city that was really devastated by the War of 1812. And in August of 1814, the Capitol and the White House had both been burned by the British. And 10 years later, the city was still rebuilding. This image is of the Capitol seen from the West Front in 1824, pictured around the time of Lafayette's arrival. It was hoped that the Capitol would be rebuilt in time for Lafayette's arrival. It looks a little bit different than the Capitol that we see today, right? Much smaller. The Capitol has been greatly built over time since the country has expanded. But the first dome that we see here was originally made of wood and copper, and the rotunda and that dome was completed for Lafayette's visit. Lafayette entered Washington in a large procession. He was greeted by members of the military and citizens on the east front of the Capitol building. And when Washingtonians came out to see Lafayette, he in turn also brought a gift for them. This portrait was done by the artist Ari Scheffer, and it was given by Lafayette as a gift to Congress during his tour. The portrait was placed in the rotunda for the majority of the tour before later being moved to the House chamber. Throughout the tour, Lafayette received an overwhelming amount of requests from artists to sit for portraits, and understandably, his time was quite limited, and very few of those requests could be honored. So instead, artists would travel here to Washington to view the Sheffer portrait in lieu of having the ability to have the subject sit for them themselves. So if you notice why many portraits of Lafayette that were done around the 1820s all kind of look like this portrait, that's why. After a very brief ceremony at the Capitol and a quick tour, Lafayette boarded his carriage and headed straight to the White House, where President Monroe was waiting to greet him. During their meeting, Monroe told Lafayette that he had originally intended his guest to use the White House as his primary residence during his time in the city, but the residents of the city protested. He said that the people of Washington claim you. They say you are the nation's guest and that nobody other than themselves has the right to house you. Lafayette became a fixture in Washington during the winter of 1824 and 1825. When the cold weather set in and travel became more difficult, Lafayette made Washington his home base. He did travel nearby, short trips to places like Baltimore and Annapolis, but he largely remained in Washington itself, attending dinner parties and going to the theater and becoming a fixture of the Washington social scene. And although his trip was not inherently political, Lafayette's visit had massive political implications. The election of 1824 between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson was one of the most tumultuous in American history. While politics were divisive across the nation, tensions in Washington were especially at an all-time high. The election was the first where neither of the candidates had either served in the Revolution or had a hand in the nation's founding documents. Without the rose-colored memories of the founders to guide voters, the nation was at a crossroads. What was the path for the future of the presidency? Was it reserved for those connected to the family names of the revolution, or would America be a country where the common man would be elected to the highest office? Similar to the equally bitter election of 1800, the Electoral College was tied in 1824, turning the outcome of the election over to the House of Representatives. Lafayette was present in the House chamber on February 9th, 1825, when John Quincy Adams was elected the sixth president of the United States. That evening, President Monroe hosted a reception at the White House where Lafayette, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson were all in attendance. Lafayette was witness to the first public moment that the new president-elect and the man defeated had. When Jackson entered the reception, guests wondered how these two men would interact, and to the delight or perhaps chagrin of many, Jackson quickly made his way over to the opponent to clasp his hand in his own in congratulations. And perhaps no one was more relieved than John Quincy Adams, who appeared profoundly moved by the gesture. Lafayette's arrival appeared to be a magic balm for what newspapers were calling the electoral zeal that had enveloped the nation. He did not sway politics personally by publicly endorsing a candidate, but people seemed to really behave when he was around. You would have politicians who were engaged in literal screaming matches and on the verge of fisticuffs the day before, seated side by side at dinner, raising a toast to Lafayette and the future prosperity of America. He had a very unique ability to bring people together in a way that I think it's quite difficult for our modern minds to wrap our heads around. And a large part of that is what Hamilton had mentioned in that letter earlier. The only thing in which our parties agree is to love you. Lafayette was very aware of his bipartisan popularity, and throughout the tour, he uses this to his advantage. Throughout his career, Lafayette held passionate anti-slavery views, and he was not blind to the presence of slavery in America. About 10 years after Lafayette's death, English abolitionist Thomas Clarkson quoted Lafayette as saying, "I would have never drawn my sword to the cause of America if I could have conceived that thereby I was founding a land of slavery." Throughout his personal correspondence and public appearances during the national tour, Lafayette frequently went out of his way to acknowledge free and enslaved men who aided him in America. One of these is a man named James Armistead, who was an enslaved soldier who, during the Revolution, worked as a double agent to the benefit of the Americans, feeding the British false information and relaying that intelligence back to Lafayette. Armistead enlisted in the Army in 1781 with the distinct request of serving in Lafayette's regiment. Assuming various roles as a runaway slave and courier, Armistead navigated across the Army lines virtually undetected. His work gave Lafayette advanced warning about approaching British reinforcements, which in turn gave Americans enough time to secure a blockade at Yorktown. After the war, Armistead petitioned for his freedom. However, unlike other Black veterans who were freed after the passage of the Act of 1783, Armistead's services were through espionage and not combat, which meant that he was not eligible for his freedom. In 1784, Lafayette came to his aid, and he penned a testimonial confirming Armistead's services to his country and to Lafayette personally. And a broadside copy of Lafayette's testimonial is here on the right, but Lafayette's handwriting is very hard to read. So this is what it says. This is to certify that the bearer by the name of James has done essential services to me while I had the honor to command in this state. His intelligences from the Army's camp were industriously collected and faithfully delivered. He has perfectly acquitted himself with some important commissions I gave him and appears to me entitled to every reward his situation can admit of. Lafayette's words helped push Armistead's story into public consciousness, and James Armistead won his emancipation in 1787. As a sign of gratitude to the man who employed him and helped to fight for his freedom, James chose a new surname, and he went by James Armistead Lafayette. James attempted to see Lafayette in Yorktown when Lafayette returned to Yorktown in October of 1824, but he was unable to raise enough funds to make the journey. So it was in Richmond a few weeks later when Lafayette's carriage entered the city when the reunion took place. Lafayette saw James in the crowd. He immediately ordered the carriage to stop. He called James's name out and reached out to him, and the two men embraced in the midst of the crowd. Around the same time, James sat for the only known portrait of his likeness with the artist John Blennerhassett Martin, and that's the portrait you see on the left-hand side. It is unclear how James crossed paths or if Lafayette had a hand in their meeting or commissioning of the portrait, because even for free Black men, this type of portrait was incredibly unusual. So it is highly likely that Lafayette had a hand in getting this portrait commissioned. This portrait was widely distributed. It was used on the broadsides with facsimiles of Lafayette's declaration of Armistead's war service, which once again spurred James' story into collective memory. The time of the production of these broadsides aligns with Lafayette's tour, and it appears that they were circulated to celebrate the connection between these two men, and especially for those who held similar anti-slavery views, further connecting Lafayette with the abolitionist movement. Unfortunately, this brief reunion would be the last time the two heroes of Yorktown would meet. James Armistead Lafayette died on August 9th, 1830. In the summer of 1825, Lafayette returns to Washington to close out his tour. He spends his last weeks in America paying final visits to friends, including Monroe, Jefferson, and Madison. And on September 6, 1825, Lafayette celebrated his 68th birthday at a grand celebration at the White House. The very next day, on September 7th, a large procession accompanied him to the Navy Yard, where he departed America for the final time. Lafayette's farewell was an emotional one, with politicians, city officials, and residents crowding the docks in the hopes of getting one final glance. President John Quincy Adams delivered an address of gratitude for Lafayette and wished him well on his journey home, hoping that he would be aided by the shouts of unbidden thousands which greeted your landing on the soil of freedom, have followed every step of your way, and still resound like the rushing of many waters from every corner of our land. That was one sentence out of like a whole page that he read. 24 cannons boomed, and Lafayette embraced the president, his friend of nearly half a century, for the very final time. Lafayette boarded a steamship that would take him to the USS Brandywine, the frigate that was ordered to carry him home to France. So much of Lafayette's life is wrapped up with these really beautiful bookends, these losses and triumphs that are wrapped together, that the symbolism can almost be read as fictional. When Lafayette arrived in New York to launch his tour in August of 1824, a rainbow stretched over lower Manhattan. At the time, a spectator cried out that the sky was in agreement with Americans in celebrating the happy arrival of the friend from their country. In September of 1825, Lafayette's departure from Washington to France was delayed by nightfall, and the ship remained anchored for an additional night. In the morning, as the crew aboard the Brandywine entered the Chesapeake Bay, a large and brilliant rainbow arched triumphantly across the water. With one end of the prism on the Maryland shore and another on Virginia, the ship sailed under the brilliant colors as Lafayette bade farewell to the nation that had shown him so much love, and a love he returned throughout his lifetime. Lafayette never again returned to America. When he died in 1834, he was buried next to his wife at Picpus Cemetery in Paris. Once the news of his death reached America, President Andrew Jackson ordered the same funeral honors and mourning that was observed for George Washington. Flags were flown at half-mast, members of Congress wore mourning bands, and the chambers were dressed in black bunting, and mock funerals were held across the country. This portrait of Lafayette, gifted to the nation during the tour, was moved from the rotunda to the old House Chamber, a room known today as National Statuary Hall. When the House moved to their new chamber in 1857, the portrait followed, and it still remains there to this day. When you watch congressional proceedings or the State of the Union addresses, Lafayette is always there. The placement in the House chamber does have an important meaning. On December 10th, 1824, Lafayette was the first foreign dignitary to address Congress. To this day, he is the only private non-citizen to address the chamber. In addition to the recognition of his services during the Revolution, Congress also gave him $200,000, essentially a repayment of what he had spent during the Revolution, and a land grant near what is present-day Tallahassee, Florida. He did keep the money. He then sold off the land grant to Florida. He didn't move to Florida, unfortunately. For all the mutual love between Lafayette and America that the tour left behind, it would take some time before Americans formally honored him with citizenship. While the states of Maryland and Virginia gave Lafayette honorary citizenship prior to the ratification of the Constitution, Congress did not make necessary measures on a national level until 2002. When the joint resolution was signed by President George W. Bush in August of that year, Lafayette posthumously became only the sixth person to have the honor. 200 years later, Lafayette still has the ability to draw crowds. I think the presence in the room tonight is proof of that. And although he was not an American statesman, his selfless assistance during the war, alongside his relationship with George Washington, raised him to a status that few achieved. However, unlike Washington, Lafayette holds a very quiet presence in American memory. His portrait is not on currency. His legacy is not a capital city bearing his name or a marble obelisk. Lafayette's accomplishments were great. He was a major general in the Continental Army. He was a statesman who was motivated by the concepts of human liberty and equality. He was an outspoken supporter of anti-slavery causes who inspired thousands. As we enter this bicentennial year, it becomes obvious that we are missing a Lafayette-like figure these days, someone who reaches across party lines and is universally adored. So as we spend this next year celebrating Lafayette's values, his passion, and his celebrity, I urge each and every person in this room and watching to reflect on this final question. How can those of us who are inspired by Lafayette's words and actions continue his work today? Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We will have a Q&A session. If I could kindly ask that you wait for the microphone so our friends on Zoom could hear you. My colleague Paul will work that side and I'll be on this side. So we'll start right here in the front row.
So I didn't quite get where Lafayette stayed while in Washington. And are there any other landmarks that might have been here during that time that he would have frequented, during his stay in Washington?
So he stayed in public hotels a lot. What Gadsby's Hotel in DC, he stayed there. He also stayed in private homes. He was very close with the Custuses, so he was at Tudor Place often. He was over at Arlington House, which at the time was part of DC, he did stay at the White House eventually. Now, when he comes back in the later end of his tour, he accepts John Quincy Adams' offer and he does stay at the White House. He was close, very close with John Quincy Adams. So I don't know if that's partially like he does want to stay with his friend. And also, it's the end of the tour. He's 68 years old. I think he also just wanted some privacy and not just necessarily being like a guest in a stranger's house necessarily. Because when he stayed in Alexandria, the city took it up to a commission of who was going to host him. And he stayed at what's now known as the Lafayette House. It was Elizabeth Lawrison's house. It's on the corner of Duke and St. Asaph Street. And he had no connection to her. And that he was just put up in there for a night. So I think by the end of the tour, he was like, hey, I'll stay with a friend.
Thank you for that lecture. It was very interesting.
Thank you. And in terms of other landmarks, the DC's changed so much since the 1820s. The Capitol and the White House are really the big things that are really still around, except for some things in Georgetown, like City Tavern, I think is another like and Tudor Place as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Reese, for such a wonderful presentation to enrich the history of General Lafayette. I have a question. Do you know which president nominated or designated the park across from the White House to be nominated Lafayette Park?
Yeah, Lafayette Park has a really interesting kind of story. It is like casually known as Lafayette Square, Lafayette Park after his tour, but it doesn't really become more formalized until closer to the turn of the 20th century, and especially when it starts being used and associated with the suffragist movement. Laura Oricchio, who wrote Marquis Reconsidered, really kind of marries these two ideas of like Lafayette Square becoming the place where people yell at their government and how Lafayette would have loved that, which I think is just fantastic. But it doesn't become like a formal like name until much later. I can't think of it off the top of my head right now, but I don't think there's like a person who's like, we're going to name it this. It's like, it was like casually known as that. And then it eventually just becomes a thing. I know there is a wonderful page on the White House Historical Association website that has it all laid out. I just can't think of it off the top of my head. There was President's Park, and then it was because it was like also like a farmer's market. Yeah, like I can see like the information. It's just like gone, but yeah.
A few questions. Do you know whether the original portrait of Mr. Armistead still exists and where it is?
Yes, it is at the Valentine in Richmond.
What's it called?
The Valentine?
Is that a museum?
Yes, it's in Richmond.
And then can you just say a little bit about, you said, was it like an almost, I can't remember enough about 1798 history, an almost war with France or a sort of war?
Yeah, the quasi-war. So the quasi-war with France comes about because France spends a bunch of money to aid our revolution, and then we don't pay it back. This is the Cliff Notes version of the quasi-war. My military historian friends are probably steam coming out of their ears right now. We are like don't really pay back the funds that they were helping us. So then we enter this kind of Cold War. No, there's no like real military conflict, but Hamilton was very not pro-France and Jefferson was very pro-France. So it becomes this Federalist, Democratic, Republican like kind of tension.
Just one last thing you mentioned, I think that Lafayette may have stayed at the City Tavern. I don't know if you're aware, the City Tavern Club went out of business about a month ago. So if you know any lovers of American history who have $5 million or more, I want to buy the building and preserve it.
Everybody in this room, get your pockets open.
But please pass that along because I think probably some developer will buy it.
My goodness.
Anyway,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful talk. My name is Scott Talon. I'm now a professor at American University, but years ago I was mayor of Lafayette, California, one of, I think, 17 cities and towns named after him. 2 years ago, I tried to find the Picpus Cemetery in Paris. It's not easy. I had a lobbyist friend, Ron Phillips, who helped guide me there, and I found it. It's super hidden on purpose. And I heard, and this is my question, that every July 14th or July 4th, the State Department or someone from the embassy goes and pays respects to Lafayette.
Yes, so Picpus Cemetery, which is very difficult to find, and I have heard that the only people who are looking for him are American tourists.
Yeah.
There is an American flag that is flown over his grave. It is the only place during the Nazi occupation that the flag was left alone. It is every July 4th. There is a ceremony, and it is attended to also by the DAR Rochambeau chapter, also, which some Lafayette descendants are also members of that chapter as well. And there's a ceremony at his grave as well. So, but yes, it is very difficult to find.
And I heard that the Nazis during World War II tried to find his grave because of the American flag, but did not.
Difficult for them as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've had so many historic TV series and musicals about some people that we didn't know a whole lot about really at the time. I mean, John Adams had a great HBO series, and then of course the musical Hamilton. And it just amazes me with the arc of Lafayette's life and the highs and the lows and the highs and the lows, and then the grand exit. I mean, you couldn't write a better script, but just making it up out of whole cloth. Do you know if anybody is planning to do something like that?
I
It's
haven't-
too much for just one movie.
I know. I think his life lends to a miniseries so well. I was personally very excited to see him so included in the Franklin miniseries, which I thought was an absolutely fantastic like depiction of him and as like that very young, like 19-year-old enthusiasm. I haven't heard anything, and second I do, I'll have it on my like to watch list. I can't wait. But like, yeah, even like that rainbow like thing. I'm like, it's everything in his life is like, if you brought that to a producer, they'd be like, this is unbelievable. You're gonna have to edit this down. But yeah, I'm hoping with this excitement with the Bicentennial, maybe people are like, all right, we gotta get this on the screen somehow. A couple like international ones. Hopefully, cross our fingers.
So at this point in 1824, where's Lafayette?
Right now,
What's he doing right now?
he's in Baltimore. He's about to come here. He's going to be here in a couple days. So, but in this moment, I'm not like off the top of my head. I think he's at a theater or a ball in Baltimore. I know he's in Baltimore.
We do have a few questions on Zoom if you don't
Sure,
mind.
yeah.
All right. You mentioned the transportation or lack thereof
Yes.
at the beginning. Was Lafayette expecting such an extensive tour when he originally came over here?
No, it was supposed to be about 3 months. And then more and more people just kept asking him to come, and it kept getting extended. I know with the tour being retraced with the American Friends of Lafayette, executive director of AFL, Chuck Schwam, constantly says, like, we're having a hard time keeping up with him. And it's true. And like, you would think that, 200 years ago, keeping up with what you had like back then should be easy. We've got planes, trains, and automobiles. It is very hard keeping up with him and the route and the stamina that he had. So yeah, he was all over the place. And when people asked him to come, he would come, really no questions asked, which I am not in my late 60s, and I hear what if someone asks me to do something, I have to think about it 20 times. So I commend him for that.
Very good. These next two are your personal opinion. The first one, do you have a favorite adventure or incident from the farewell tour?
Ooh, do I have a favorite instance? I like when he's reunited with the Custises. I am a little biased. I do work at Nellie Custis's house. So the reunions that he has with them and the memories that he had from when he stayed at Mount Vernon, and of course the relationship with George Washington, those kind of like nostalgic reunions are very sweet. So I think I would have to say those, especially the reunions at Woodlawn, because that's where I work. So it's like I literally stand in the same ground. So that's, I work at Woodlawn, which is Nellie Custis's house.
Another personal opinion question, getting back to the Lafayette series. Who is the ideal actor to play Lafayette, in your opinion?
I'm going to take a cop-out answer and a complete unknown, because the person who played him in the Franklin miniseries, I did not know who he was, and I thought he was fantastic. So I think it would have to be someone that I have no idea who they are and would just blow me away. So I'm sorry, that's a very cop-out question answer.
Perfect. Thank you. And I guess I'll give you the time to plug. You're the committee chairman for the Washington, D.C. part of the American Friends of Lafayette.
If
He's
you-
almost in town. What's going on?
Yeah, if you are interested in Lafayette events in DC or in your area, if you're not necessarily in DC, Lafayette200.org has all the information of what is going on for the next, well, now it's just under a year until September of 2025, and there's more information to go. So if you can't get enough of Lafayette, we have events to give you, and hopefully you can get involved as well. So that's my plug.
Perfect. Elizabeth,
Awesome.
thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming out in person and at home. Get home safe. We'll see you next time.